Moggcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg about the topics of the day.
Welcome to another edition of the Moggcast, which resumes. I'm Paul Goodman, editor of Conservative Home, and I'm here in conversation with a mercifully COVID-free Jacob Rees-Mogg. So, Jacob, welcome. And you have not got COVID, we hear?
No, one of my children was tested, and I'm glad to say the test came back negative. One of my children had a temperature, and therefore went to Bristol Airport, where they do tests, and was found to be negative, which is all very good news.
And so here we are, for the benefit of the listeners. This isn't being done over Zoom, it's being recorded live in Jacob's office in the Commons, where he works as Leader of the House. So, let's get down to business and try and start in this way, which is that if we reproved the Chinese for their behaviour in relation to Hong Kong, and they pleaded difficult and highly exceptional circumstances, what would our response to that be?
Our response to what is going on in Hong Kong in relation to the joint declaration is that the Chinese did a deal to maintain the liberties of Hong Kong for 50 years, and that they are eroding the liberties of the people of Hong Kong. They are cheating on a deal. And we are entitled to point that out, and we're entitled to take measures to protect the people of Hong Kong, is why we've offered a route to citizenship for British nationals overseas who live in Hong Kong, who have a right to expect support from the British government. That's what we're doing. That's surely the right thing to do.
The question that comes back is we've also signed a treaty, we signed a withdrawal agreement last year. And now, in this UK internal market bill that will come before the Commons this week, we want to resile from certain clauses in it that we signed and agreed only last year.
Well, I think that's an uncharacteristic simplification of the situation. I'm rather surprised at Conservative Home ever simplifying in such a way. What is being done is an emergency protection in case the EU is outrageously unreasonable. So, there is a joint committee which will deal with goods going from GB to Northern Ireland, and which ones are at risk, and which ones therefore may need to have some direct declarations around them before going to Northern Ireland in case they go into the Republic. However, there is the risk that the EU has raised in the negotiations. So it's come from the EU, it's not a phantasm evolving from the mind of our political leaders, that they might say that food exports from GB to Northern Ireland would not be permitted under the terms of the agreement. And what is being done is taking a reserve power to ensure that can be done, that we can carry on providing food. So Tesco's in GB can export food to Tesco's in Northern Ireland to ensure that Tesco's shelves are full, and other supermarkets likewise will want to do the same thing, want to be able to do the same thing, because the agreement recognises the territorial integrity of the United Kingdom in a different part, and it recognises that Northern Ireland is part of the customs union of the United Kingdom in a different part, but the EU does potentially have an ability to stop food going from GB to Northern Ireland. And what is being done is legislating to prevent that from happening by giving powers to the UK government to override the treaty if the treaty were interpreted in that way. So you say to me, why go out on a limb and say this could be a technical and narrow breach of international law, rather than arguing that actually, because it would require a breach of good faith within the treaties, it's a perfectly reasonable response. And the reason for that is that the courts need to interpret UK law as UK law and not get involved in matters of international law. We want this settled under our own law, not international law, so that what Parliament says will be clear and determinative, and the courts won't be able to say, well, Parliament can't have meant this, because it would be in breach of international law. So it narrows down any risk of legal challenge to the clarity of what the UK government would do to protect the supply of food, for example, to Northern Ireland.
Let's just go back for a moment, and you've explained that these safeguarding measures need to come in. The reason for that, is it not, is that we are concerned that the courts would reach judgments that, were not in the government's view in favour of the national interests on tariffs or on the applicability of state aid provisions that apply in Northern Ireland and Great Britain. The reason that has happened is because the withdrawal agreement that we negotiated has left open that possibility.
Well, I think crucially, the withdrawal agreement was ratified by an Act of Parliament, and the Act of Parliament included Section 38, and Section 38 gave primacy to UK law. And the EU accepted our means of ratification. So therefore, they accepted the Act of Parliament which gave supremacy to UK law. So this is completely in line with the way in which we ratified the treaty. And that's something I think has been overlooked during these recent discussions. But in any treaty, well, let's go back to the Treaty of Utrecht. The Treaty of Utrecht gave us, among other things, Gibraltar. And it gave us Gibraltar as a cannon shot, as I understand it, from the high point in towards the Spanish mainland. Well, you could argue, I suppose, that you could go and get a very large cannon now and fire it a good deal further than you could have done in the early 18th century. And therefore, if you were to look back at the Treaty of Utrecht, you could discover we were allowed to have a little bit more land rather than a little bit less, as the Spanish might like. But that wouldn't be within the spirit of the treaty, even if it might be in the legal wording. But there are also, in the Treaty of Utrecht, pieces of international law we've been ignoring for probably centuries, because it prohibits anybody of the Jewish faith from living in Gibraltar. But we don't take any notice. So international law is part of the relationships between states. It is not open to a single interpretation nor the clarity with which domestic law has, nor does it have a court that can give final rulings on it in the same way. The Vienna Convention on the International Court being able to rule on disputes between international bodies and sovereign nations has never been ratified. So there isn't this clarity, there is opinion. And what the government is trying to do is to narrow this down so that in UK law, it is quite clear that what is determined by Parliament and government is the law, and in the UK, it is not open to further challenge within the UK courts. And that seems quite right, because the best law is the clearest law, so that you don't then leave it open to judges to have to interpret what Parliament may have meant. What Parliament will have meant will be perfectly clear.
Now, let's accept, for whatever reason, we need these safeguarding measures in the event of no deal. The question really is, why have we put ourselves in the position where Brandon Lewis got to his feet in the Commons last week and said that in a certain very limited way, we will be breaking international law by resigning from the withdrawal agreement, when the Prime Minister wrote in the Daily Telegraph over the weekend, as backed up by David Frost on Twitter yesterday, that the EU is threatening a food blockade of Great Britain. Surely, in this event, the EU would be breaking international law, not the UK.
But just because the EU might be breaking international law wouldn't necessarily mean that any action taken in response to that would de facto be within international law.
It wouldn't necessarily mean it, but the distinguished Eurosceptic lawyer Martin Howe, and I believe the ERG, are arguing that there's nothing illegal about what we would be doing.
But the point that I was trying to make is that if, before legislating, the government says this may be in breach of international law, when it gets to the Supreme Court can't cast it aside and say, well, this is in breach of international law, therefore it's not valid, because Parliament will knowingly have legislated to override international law, and Parliament is the supreme sovereign authority in this country, and the courts could not therefore override a statute that had been passed explicitly acknowledging that it might be in breach of international law. You can then argue whether it is in breach of international law or not, and I've got a lot of sympathy for Martin Howe's point of view.
I entirely get the point about wishing to send a very clear message to the domestic courts. Wouldn't the political context have been easier if the negotiation falls apart? The EU can legitimately be argued to be acting in bad faith. They try a food blockade. They're arguably in breach of the rather ambiguous Northern Ireland Protocol. You could have just rushed a bill through the Commons then to do the safeguarding.
Do you think so? Do you think so? If you look at the opposition that's come to this bill from all the same people who backed Remain before, if you brought it in December, then the House of Lords would effectively have a veto on this bill. You could not rush it through and be certain of getting it through the House of Lords. Just look at, they all come out of the woodwork. Tony Blair's come out of the woodwork. He was always a great recruiting sergeant for Brexiteers, but out he comes, that great respecter of international law himself. You know, he paid great attention to it throughout his political career. Always a man of the highest standards in this regard. He has spoken. He himself has spoken. We would have had all that, and we would have had very little time to do it. The job of government surely is to prepare for events, not just to react to events, and this is sensible preparation.
I put the counter case, which is you're acting now without actually having accused the EU of acting in bad faith formally, and without the negotiation having broken down. It seems utterly inconceivable if even the main body of the rebels are willing in principle to pass the safeguarding. They just want a parliamentary vote to do it rather than some more indirect means. It's surely inconceivable that in the event of the negotiation breaking down, if it's the EU's fault, Parliament with a Conservative majority of 80 wouldn't be able to get the safeguarding measures through.
Well, I think there are some things that are the right preserve of the executive and some that are the right preserve of Parliament. And I think that this confuses the two. And I didn't think that was a good idea when Parliament tried to be the government before the election last year. I don't think Parliament inserting itself in the midst of international relations is where Parliament has ever constitutionally been. I think that is clearly the job of the executive. And although we have no formal separation of powers, executive action being taken by the government and held accountable to Parliament is a preferable way of doing it. I would turn it on its head. I would say that if this power were used frivolously, then any government could risk losing a vote in the House of Commons, which would be the right way to do it, rather than to have a pre-approval vote. I think just constitutionally that is the more normal way of proceeding. And I'd be saying exactly the same thing if I were on the backbenches. This isn't a sort of special pleading by a minister. It is actually how I think the Constitution ought to work. I've never been in favour of parliamentary votes prior to military action. For example, I think constitutionally they're anomalous and they make the running of the country more difficult.
Now, I've learned from bitter experience, never, when writing about a contentious bill, to assume that the state of play on day one will necessarily be the state of play on day 4 or 5. Governments sometimes make concessions, backbench amendments pop up that are helpful, all sorts of things happen. So it's in the light of that I wanted to ask you, are you absolutely sure that the government won't concede a parliamentary vote of the kind that the so-called rebels are pushing for?
That there are no plans to do that the government has set out its stall and expects to win votes in the House of Commons. And therefore, why would it want to do this? But more importantly, I don't think it is the right constitutional thing to do. I think Parliament holds to account, it doesn't give pre-approval.
Do you think there will be a deal?
A deal of a free trade kind, I think, still remains possible, and we should try to get one. In a funny sort of way, all this activity helps because it makes the EU realise that we are serious and that we're not going to back down. We're not going to do what the previous government, frankly, did and at every turn in the negotiations ultimately give in to what the EU demanded for fear of what might happen. We're saying, look, not only are we not going to give in to you, but if you try and do things that are unreasonable, we're going to react, and here's how we will respond. You see, if we hadn't been doing this, the EU could have been thinking, well, on the 1st of January, we'll stop them sending food to Northern Ireland. And they'll have no legal mechanism of doing anything about it at all. We would have been stuck. And instead, we are, like good Boy Scouts, prepared.
Just a last question on this. When, in the wake of Brandon Lewis making his statement, I asked the authorities for a brief. I said, look, if you're saying that liberal democratic states sometimes deliberately breach international law, if you're saying that British governments are sometimes prepared to, this is an argument put by Lord Keane, as you'll know,
Very
in the
well
laws,
put,
in the
yes.
laws last week. Can you send me a brief? Now, the authorities have got other things to do than send me a brief, but it duly arrived. Do you think you've been a bit slow in making your case that the Canadians deliberately breached international law, so the government argues over cannabis, that Australia did over refugees, that the Human Rights Act contains a provision by which a government can declare it's out of step with international law? Do you think you've been a bit slow in getting this across? Because to me it seems that you have.
And I've managed to come up with the Treaty of Utrecht, which we deliberately, gratuitously break. Well, we haven't discussed it before. And nobody would possibly want us to implement certain clauses of the Treaty of Utrecht, even though it was an agreement signed in good faith by a previous British government. I think with all these things, arguments evolve and different points of view get expressed. I thought Lord Keane's point on the Human Rights Act was actually fundamentally important, that in our own law we have legislative provision for overriding international law. But I think you have to look at international law in a different way from domestic law. That international law is a means of codifying diplomatic and political agreements. It is not something with a bewigged judge and a jury saying, guilty, take him down. It is politics and diplomacy by another means. But Bill Cash often uses the term legal politico and politico-legal. And this is very much in the politico-legal category.
Are you bound to follow it under the terms of the Ministerial Code?
The Ministerial Code refers to domestic law.
There was a reference to international law previously, wasn't there? But David Cameron took it out, if I remember correctly.
Yes.
I think he argued that its continuation was implied. Let's change the subject, because, although Brexit is of compelling interest to Conservative Home readers, and this matter of international law is clearly very important, I'm willing to bet it is not a public preoccupation, and that your ordinary voter in the street is much more likely to be thinking about the rule of six and whether or not they're going to be able to gather at Christmas. Where do you think we are with coronavirus? Because there is a strain of opinion on the right that says the NHS isn't under threat. The number of cases may be going up, but the number of hospitalisations, number of deaths has fallen remarkably. There's a balance to strike between dealing with COVID and economic damage. There's a balance to strike between dealing with COVID and other health-related issues like cancer treatments, cancelled operations, domestic abuse, and all that. Where do you think the balance of the argument lies? Because it's clear the government doesn't quite have the same benefit of the doubt with the public that it did in March.
Well, time has gone on, and views have evolved, and facts are different, but still this remains a new disease where not everything is known about it. It seems to have a very low risk amongst the young, indeed negligible this risk amongst the young, but a risk that gets much higher as people get older, much higher as people get older. I think there was a piece in the Times on Saturday saying that it's 1,000 times greater for an 80-year-old as against a 20-year-old, and that's a very important consideration.
The government hasn't ruled out a second national lockdown, has it?
Well, it's indicated that it is an unlikely possibility.
Though we are now moving very definitely, having had restrictions, having come out of restrictions, back to new forms of restrictions with curfews, marshals, fines. I suppose we had fines
We've had
before.
fines. We've had fines before. The fines have never gone away.
We haven't had marshals before, have we?
We haven't had marshals, but
What powers will these marshals have?
well, from what I've read in the newspapers, they will be able to ask you politely in a very British way if you wouldn't mind awfully standing 6.5 feet away from people.
Has nobody told you that those will be the powers that they'll have, or that they might have other powers?
I have not seen that the marshals will have police powers.
Do you think they should?
I'm very happy with government policy as it is.
Which means you don't want to be drawn on the subject, and the suggestion is that you would not like to have marshals having police powers.
The role of constable is one of great importance and has always been very rightly protected in our society. Very few people in this country have the right to issue fines except in the most specific circumstances, or indeed to enforce the law. Those people who go up and down the motorways in Highways England cars are there to help with the traffic flow. They are not constables, and therefore they can't stop you speeding, they can't enforce the law, because that is not their role. And I think protecting the role of constable is something we have always done in this country.
Last question, on housing and planning. In previous conversations, you've floated the prospect of zoning. You've always been an enthusiast for building more, and have been, I think, prepared to stand up for sections of party opinion that isn't happy at the prospect of building more. According to your colleague and our columnist, Neil O'Brien, who wrote a very widely read column about all this a few weeks ago, according to him, the building in Tory areas is going to rise. The building in Labour-held areas is not going to rise so fast. In the last resort, government is able to say, under these plans, you've got to take such and such a number. How you work it out is up to you. Is this really going to get through the Commons?
We need to build more houses. I find, speaking to Conservative associations, which I do a great deal of, recently by Zoom, which isn't quite so satisfactory, but nonetheless, it's still worth doing. I find that the parliamentary party is not necessarily as developed in its thinking as our members. I think our members don't particularly want development, but they recognise that it is needed because we need to build more houses. And I think that's the truth. But the question is, how do you build these houses? And the problem is, since the 1940s, what have we done? We have built houses according to government direction that have become smaller, so the square footage has declined, with less outside space, so the garden has declined. We have increased density, and we have built to a degree of uniformity that has made beauty entirely secondary, if not tertiary, if not centenary, if that's the right word. And I think what we need to do is build type of properties, type of homes that people actually want, which means rather bigger, with more outside space, not less, to recognise that a garden is just as much a green space as a field, and to be beautiful. And beauty is in the eye of the beholder. It's not in the eye of the planning officer. It's certainly not in the eye of the general bureaucracy, which is sort of what you get in Eastern European building of the 1970s. And I'm always struck by the thought that you would never get permission to build the Royal Crescent in Bath today. It would be refused. And yet one of the most beautiful crescents in the world, probably, part of a World Heritage City, would not now be buildable. And that seems to me to be a mistake. So we need to build more, we need to make it beautiful, we need to have more green space with it. And I think if you do that, lots of people will say, fair enough, this is a good thing to do. And you do, I'm afraid, need to build where people actually want to live rather than where they don't want to live. and people seem to want to live in conservative areas. Probably because they've got such marvellous MPs and they just like that feeling of security that they have when they've got a good Tory representing them.
But there's a bit of work to do with these marvellous MPs because they're not quite so advanced on the subject, in your view, as councillors and local members.
I don't know about councillors. I think local members of our party have, in the meetings I've done over recent years, become reconciled to the thought that more building needs to be done. Where Tory MPs are, I don't really know. I think it's very variable. I think some recognise this. I think some are very opposed. I think also that some have particular difficulties, that some constituencies are a very high percentage green belt, and the green belt is different. The green belt does serve a purpose of stopping urban sprawl, though within the green belt there are some very ungreen areas.
Jacob, thank you very much. I've enjoyed this Moggcast. It's good to be back to business, and coronavirus notwithstanding, I hope we're able to do it again in a fortnight.
Thank you very much. Thank you for coming in.
The Moggcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg about the topics of the day.